application. All right, we'll click that button. Now we're good to go. All right, first slide. David, please go ahead and introduce yourself briefly if you want to.
Thanks everyone for joining this workshop. I'm David Granjon. I'm working at Novartis as data scientist. You probably know me because of my open source activities. I'm mainly active in the Shiny environment. I developed some packages. You may know BS for Dash, Shiny Dashboard Plus. And I recently wrote a book which has been submitted for production last week in the R series in CRC Press. So hopefully you'll get it next year. That's a real pleasure to be here for that workshop.
Thanks, David. And John, myself, so I work for Opifex, which is a small consultancy I just set up this year. And you may also, hopefully, know me for some of my open source packages, like, well, one of them we're going to use now, Initialize for R, or my book, Javascript for R. All right, let's move on. So what do we have? So the idea is we just do 2 hours. So in that respect, what we have is more of a code along, and we didn't do exercises like last year. They tend to take a lot of time, and we recognize they cause some frustration. So we're going to have a quick introduction. And then we have something on bundling with Packer, which is the package mentioned previously, which we're going to use. And then then a bit on our project setup, we have a break. Then it's mainly David taking the reins to talk about Framework 7, which we'll introduce shortly, before we take another break and we quickly wrap up. It says grab a coffee. I'm mostly very confused about what time it is where you are. So maybe it's not coffee anymore, something else. In any event, so we're gonna, like I said, we're gonna do a code along. So what's important here is that you get the slides. They're available online at this address. I'm gonna leave this slide up. So you may have seen that in the GitHub repository, there's a whole bunch of things in order to get that set up and working for you at home. However, the magicians at RStudio managed to set up an instance of RStudio training for us last minute. So I don't know if you want me to introduce that myself, Phil, or perhaps you do a better job of introducing how people can get that set up so that you don't have to follow the instructions there.
Yeah, absolutely. I'm happy to do that. Do you want me to take people through it now?
Do you need to share screen? Maybe I should do it. That'll be easier. I'll go ahead and do it, and you stop me when I do.
Yes, that sounds fantastic.
All right. So you have the slides here. I'll go back to this slide in a minute. Or maybe someone can put that in the chat. That'll be much easier. In the meantime, in the chat, what we could do as well is have the link that I'm going to type in now. So we go to rstd.io/class.
Yes, I just gave it to you in the chat box. And so the reason we're doing this is just because we can get the dependencies and packages and things ready to go, so you don't have to spend a lot of the workshop getting things set up. And so what I would tell everybody on the workshop here today is let John and I do it first. You'll watch it, and then we'll go back and make sure everybody's good to go. And then I'm happy to troubleshoot one-on-one with people through the Zoom chat. But the workshop identifier is classically unleash here. And then go ahead and submit that puppy.
Zoom in a bit so it's clear. I don't know how clear it is on your screen.
Yeah, it looks great from on my screen. Now, the one difference there is when you've done this before, for the other people in the workshop that haven't, you'll need to put in your name. Your first name is fine, and then your email address. The email address isn't saved. It's not recorded. It's only used as a primary key to generate a unique server. So each and every one of you in the workshop today that wants to jump into this workshop environment, you're going to actually have your own server on EC2 on AWS. And so the nice thing about that is everybody's going to be separated from everyone else. You can't collide. You can't cause problems, with the other attendees. So when you put your, John, when you did that, it just, because you've already logged in, it took you to your existing server. For everybody else, you just put your first name, your email, and then click submit. And then when you do that, you'll see this URL. The one tricky thing that I'll mention here that's important is that the username and the password is not going to be your name and your email. The username and password is going to be unleash. So that's a really important string of text for today's workshop. Unleash is going to be the workshop identifier and the username and password for the workshop environment. So John, when you're ready, just click on that link. Now for today, we're going to be mostly working with code, and we're going to be developing Shiny apps. So we're going to go into the RStudio environment, which is the top link. It's just going to, because everybody gets a clean start, you get a fresh server. When you come in here, you're going to have a new session. So go ahead and just click on new session on the top left. We're just going to stay within RStudio today, and we're going to run everything locally on your individual servers. And so it's going to launch you into the familiar RStudio environment. And then once you're in here, you should be in pretty good shape because we've got everything on the back end installed for you. And then also it looks like we've preloaded the repository, which is there.
Exactly.
So yeah.
So the only thing to do from there is to click class repo.
Yeah. So what you can do is you can launch it as a project there. And then go ahead and click on yes. Yep. So it's going to switch you over into the individual project for the classroom for today. And yeah, I think from there, you're in pretty good shape. I don't remember, John, if there was going to be some RMP work to do or if it was ready to go.
No, it's all good. And we did the test. Thank you very much.
Okay.
Worked a treat, really. Thank you very much.
Yeah,
so,
totally.
So as said, this is what you can do if you want to follow along what we're going to do. And again, please get the slides open. That'll make life much easier for you. All right, so I'll move on to the next slide real quick, and again, go ahead in the chat and if you have any issues. So, quick introduction, and please, David, feel free to jump in here if you want. But the idea is, David has built the package Shiny Mobile. You may have heard of. I think, it's seen many contributions, but he's still by far the main contributor to this package, and it essentially allows you to develop mobile-friendly Shiny applications. We'll demo that a bit later. But the idea is that here it took David an enormous amount of time and hours in order to develop that, and because it is a fully fledged sort of framework that nicely integrates with RStudio. Now, if you find an interesting framework that you don't want to use at work, perhaps you don't want to spend 2 years doing this. So essentially in this workshop, we'll explore how we sort of take Shiny Mobile apart in a sense and just rebuild everything ourselves. Not everything, sorry, a tiny wee part. We show you how we can really quickly do that. So I think what I said on the previous slide is a bit overlaps with this, but we're going to use Packer, which I'll introduce later. And this is one of the big things that we have here, as well as the JSX, which is some sort of extension of JavaScript, which helps write cleaner code in a sense, particularly for the kind of things we're going to do. And again, we're going to introduce that a bit later in more depth. So the first bit is on this Packer thing that's been mentioned sometimes. So the idea is to be able to manage JavaScript code. So what do we mean by managing JavaScript code? Why do we do it? What it is, and mainly why it takes a form of essentially pre-processing code. The idea is when you write code, you tend to, at some point, you're going to have large projects, and you're going to need something to help you structure the code, write cleaner code, things you can maintain, etc. In R, you're going to use Drake, targets, build a package, but you're going to try and avoid having floating scripts in various folders. But in JavaScript, there's nothing such built in, so we need to bring in different solutions from the outside. Another issue that you have with JavaScript is where in our code that you wrote on R 3.6 point something will likely run on the latest version and vice versa. With JavaScript, it's very unlikely. The language is rather stable, but the syntax changes a lot from version to version. For example, on the table that you have on the screen there, this is ES6, which is actually the version of JavaScript, of the syntax of JavaScript rather, released in 2016 and which browsers support it. And as you can see, there's quite a bit of red. Not only that, you don't have to rely on users keeping their browsers up to date, which is very unlikely. So you may very well write JavaScript code that doesn't run in the browsers of your users. So we need a solution to tackle this. Another thing is code size. While in R it doesn't matter one bit, in JavaScript it does. Everything ends up in files that are loaded in the browser, and therefore the smaller the file, the better. Hence, we have this concept in the sense of minification or uglification, in a sense, where the code is going to be pre-processed, and we're going to remove everything that we just don't really need. That's just there for human readability. For example, all the white space, but also, as you can see, for example, this very simple example, variable names are shortened. But with all of that, you gain kilobytes over kilobytes, and it makes a difference on how fast your application loads. So in conclusion, we need to minify for performance. We need to transpile in order to make sure all browsers can run our code. We need to be able to manage our JavaScript code. And the idea is that then it takes the form of pre-processing the code. The code that we write no longer is the code that ultimately is imported. We write the code somewhere, it gets minified, transpiled, etc., and it's spat out somewhere else. And this is the code we import. However, all this pre-processing enables tons of other things, like dependency management, which we'll explore. So this is a fictitious example, but if dplyr was a JavaScript package, you'd likely be able to install it with npm install dplyr. It installs the package, and then in your JavaScript code, you can import just a function you need, even further reducing the size of the ultimate file that you build, since you don't import the whole of dplyr. Not only that, in JavaScript, if you've used it before, I assume you have the order of the imports of the files that you have in your HTML matters. File 1 cannot use any functions that are in file 2 because they're not loaded in the right order, etc. It becomes a nightmare. Never mind updating these dependencies. So it also enables, for example, tree shaking. You can check for dead variables, variables you declare and use, functions, etc. And it can run many other things, code checks to make sure that the code you write is correct at the time you write it, rather than wait for something to go wrong when the code is run in the browser once your project is deployed. However, there's one downside. There's probably now dozens of tools that allow you to. They work slightly differently, but in a sense, enable a bit what I said on the previous slides. There's a few of those that you need to familiarize yourself with. Then, from experience, they're really annoying to set up. They come with configuration files and things like that. Not only that, they're really not designed with R in mind. So that's where I came up with the Packer. And Packer essentially aims to become some sort of use case for using JavaScript in packages. Because the idea is to write more robust JavaScript code. It only take place in our packages. And the idea never becomes a dependency to what you're actually building. It's really just to use this to help you build. So how does it work? You create a package. From the package, or an application, which is an L package, of course. From there, from the root of your package, you just run the scaffold. Then you write some code, bundle, write some code, bundle. So in slightly more depth. What are those scaffolds? Well, the idea is totally nicked from HTML widgets. As you can read at the bottom of the slide, the idea is if you build the HTML widgets, you have this magical function that you run from the root of a package that sets up the structure of the files that you need. And essentially, Packer does the same. except it handles different things like Golem application. If you want custom outputs, and so there's slightly different structure for each. And about that, and that's a core function. You use it generally once in a package, and then you're good to go. Then you write your code in a new directory that's created called src.js. You run packer bundle. It's going to do all of these magical things we mentioned before: transpiling, unifying, etc. And it's going to spit out a file in the inst folder somewhere, depending on the scaffold. So at this stage, if there are any questions, feel free to interrupt, tell me. But at this stage, we're gonna go with the project setup, and the project setup is the idea is here we're gonna set up Packer and other things that we need here for this workshop. So what are we going to do? We're going to use Framework 7 to build a shiny application where we're going to have a custom input in using the Framework 7 in JavaScript in JSX files. It's going to send a variable to the server, and that server is going to use that variable to build a very basic ggplot2 visualization. Then we were very ambitious at the beginning, but we had to cut things short. That's why the visualization is ggplot2 and not a JavaScript visualization library. But you can do that later. We have the slides and some instructions for you if you're interested. So first thing we're going to do, I'm on slide 24 if that helps at all. So we've got this line, Packer Scaffold Framework 7. That we're going to run to set up, well, the scaffold that we need. Note that we set Framework 7 to true here. This is a recent addition by David that sets up again a scaffold for Golem specific for this Framework 7 so that we can easily get started. So let me move this here, and I have a session here. I'm going to make that full screen, zoom in a bit, I think a bit more maybe, yeah. So before I start with this, let me show you a bit the setup. What we did here is just install the packages. What we did is Golem create the Golem app, and from there we just install the packages. And that's basically it. So we have essentially, and we have the slides in there, and we use the RM, etc. But it's a blank slate essentially. And what we're going to do, you can copy the line from the slides, of course, but like we said, we're going to do scaffold Golem, and we're going to set Framework 7 to true. And it's going to take some time. So what is it doing? It's installing the dependencies that we need in order to use Packer and do all this transpiling, etc. I'm going to walk you through briefly once it's done. The first thing to know that I forgot to say on one of my slides, I apologize. When we have all these options of tools to help us do all of this, there's Webpack, Parcel, Grunt, Rollup, tons of them. Here, Packer always uses Webpack, hence the name. So once the scaffold is built, it opens a file by default. I'm going to go ahead and close that and see what was printed. So it created a src.js folder, installed Webpack that we need to bundle all this code, added tons of files to get ignore and building all of this stuff that we need for JavaScript and NPM. Added Babel. That's the magic thing that allows you to transpile the code. We can write the latest syntax, and it's going to essentially convert that to an older version of JavaScript in sense that's going to run on every browser. Added loaders. This is a concept specific to Webpack. These are actually, you can think of them as plugins. So there's one for Framework 7, so that Framework 7 works nicely with Webpack. There's a style loader and a CSS loader, which we only explored briefly here. We'll show you. But, sorry, essentially, JavaScript generally tends to, you may work a lot with CSS as well as JavaScript. They work together. You add a class, you remove a class, you look for an ID, or another selector. So it's good to essentially have them at the same place. So the most important folder in everything that was generated here is the src.js folder. And in here we had the index.js file that was opened by default, which I closed before. And in here we see this the import statements. So this imports the whole of framework 7. And then we imported CSS, and it's rather interesting that we can import a CSS file in a JavaScript file, and this will make its way ultimately to our Shiny application. And then in this we'll get into that a bit later. What I want to do in the meantime is go further down here, and you'll see that there are template files. So there are some things we need to change to our Shiny application in order for it to work. So as it says, replace or edit your app_UI.r. So I'm going to go ahead and replace it. So I'm going to copy all of this here. Right click, copy, and I'm going to go in the R directory, app_r, and here just select everything and replace. We can explore things a bit further, but in the interest of time, I might cut it short. One thing we're gonna do, if I bring back my, trying an interesting setup as you can see here. If I bring back my slides, is to bundle, load, and run the app to test. Because when we open Studio back again, as we've said, all the code, JavaScript code now sits in here, but that's not what's important in the Shiny application. Ultimately, we need something we need to bundle, as we say, all this code into a single file that's going to go into the JavaScript. And maybe one thing which I went too fast is this: the code we copied. One very important bit is this, this. We're going to create the whole application with JavaScript essentially and use R just as a server. So we're going to import, we're going to have a div with an ID of app, and this essentially to tell framework 7 that's going to create all this app where to place it. We need a main anchor, a main entry point, if you like, for the application, and it's referred here. So I'm going to do what was on the slide. So I'm going to do Packer bundle. This may take a few seconds. Sorry, go ahead, David.
John, in the appui.r, I saw there is an exclamation point you forgot to remove.
Well done. Yeah, thank you. Can I correct that? Well, I don't care too much for the implementation. I can say it. But that's only bundled the JavaScript code. And what's that done is essentially created a file. If we go to inst app www index.js. I'm not sure if you've clicked to open this file. It's quite a huge file. If it crashes something. Well, there we go. So it imported loads of stuff. It's unreadable code, as you can see, but you can recognize maybe a bit of CSS that's in here, etc. Now this is really making my browser lag, so I'm going to close it real quick. But that's essentially what it's done. So what's important to remember is every time we make a change to the files in here, we need to bundle in order to, well, have those reflected in the app. Then once we bundled, we're going to load everything. Package load we use. Package load all. Then we use the function run app from column. And it should work. There we go. So it doesn't do much, admittedly, but as you can see, this is not a traditional Shiny app. This is a basic framework this is the framework 7, and the simplest setup, I think, if I remember correctly. that one can produce with Framework 7, which I'll show you briefly. If I go to index, and that's something, yeah, I said I wanted to cover slightly real quick, a bit more. It is this concept of importing. So in this case, you could think of it a bit like in R you would do this. But here is JavaScript, so it works differently. So not coding library to an import Framework 7. However, there's this concept of now we can import functions, objects, anything from other files. So here import app from components app.f7.jsx, components here in this directory, and open this. And this is where we have the app, which is in a .jsx file. Real quick, the syntax highlighting doesn't work. JavaScript doesn't recognize JSX. But if you go in the bottom here and you select JavaScript, it may not be 100% correct, but it gives us something. And this is the hello world that we show as app title and page content that was displayed. I think I'm going to leave it at this for now. Let me get my slides back, but I think this was on the plan. And would take just a real quick 5-minute break. David and I are still here if you have any questions before we go further with this. Thank you.
Hey, could you, sorry, this is In, and is it possible for you to show the comment history? And I just want to check if I can replicate what you did here. Just history.
We only did if you joined late and you didn't see what we set up. So I'll just go to the slides. Actually, it'd be much easier. Where were we? Project setup. Just run this line if you have the slides. You just run this scaffold underscore golem free and make sure to set framework 7 to true.
Yeah, I did that and I got an error message. I can paste the error message here.
Oh, I know. Interesting. Not sure how I can get the chat to open. I'm sharing my screen. You tell me what the question, what the error is, David, or maybe you can.
I'm wondering, is the REMF project activated?
You mean like we should check the RM status? Normally it should be synchronized, good. So I can't see the chat when I'm sharing my screen.
You might double check that they're in the project.
Maybe if you're running that locally.
Yeah.
So if you came
because sorry, I think you may be running that locally. Let me send you may be running that locally, and if you grab the latest version, I think sorry, that's not how it works. Too many things. Install underscore GitHub, of course. To grab the latest version. You may be on a different version of it. That's why you may be on a different version of it. Essentially, if you're running locally, if you're running in the server, it should be. Maybe okay, I get it. You're right, Phil.
Yeah, I think that's what they forgot.
So when you land on this page, you'll know the actual repository. If you go here and click class the DR project, then it should open in the correct project.
I see.
And then things should work.
Yeah, once you've launched into the project, it will refresh our studio, and then you're going to be into a project for the classroom for today. And then you'll be working from the working directory of that project, which is class repo. And then in the console, if you run that code from the slides, it should work okay for you.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, thank you. Well, I think I'm going to stop sharing my screen and I'll give it a ring, David. Stop share now. This is good. Yeah. You're on mute, I think, David, but we can see your screen fine.
Yeah, I believe we are still in the break, right?
By a minute, maybe. Yeah, it's true.
Yeah. Okay. Just wait 1 minute. Yeah.
Yeah.
All right, well, welcome back. So let's move with this framework 7 part. So the previous part was about setting up the packet structure. And as you showed, we already built everything, the Rev project, so that you don't have to worry too much about installing dependencies. You have the golem structure plus the packer scaffold for framework 7. And now we are going to start developing the features we have to do in the workshop, that is adding framework 7 widget, which would be basically an improved select input, if you know the shiny select input, coupled to a ggplot visualization. And based on that, you'll have homework if you visualization. On my screen, what you see is on the left side you have RStudio, and on the right side you have my slide. Hopefully, it should be the right side. So just tell me if it's too small. I can slightly enlarge RStudio. Framework 7 is a first-class mobile template for the web. I don't know if you heard about that, but that's an HTML, JavaScript, CSS template, which provides native look and feel for iOS and Android support. And it also supports, you may know, progressive web apps, which are called also PWA, which provide a kind of compromise between native apps, which run with the, for Apple devices, it runs with Swift. For Android devices, it runs, you need to write Java code. So it's a compromise between native apps and pure web applications. So native apps are more optimized, and those kinds of on web apps are less optimized than native apps. So progressive web apps are in the middle. We won't cover that part today, but there was another workshop which I gave in September about that, so I can point to the link at the end of the presentation. It also works for desktop application, just in case. So here is framework 7, how it looks. On the left side, that's some demonstration, showcase where you can see all different components. So everything is mobile optimized. You can see you have cards for containers, expandable cards. You can apply effects to specific cards. And then if we take a bit more evolved application, on the right side, you have a replication of the Apple App Store made with framework 7. And here you see it's a bit better than what you see on the left side. That's something that makes more sense. So here you use all components from the framework 7 template. Many advanced things for mobile devices, like this model window. You have carousels also, which you can scroll on the left or on the right just by moving your fingers on the screens. and so on. So today, this is just about implementing only one widget, but by the end of the workshop, we'll give you some keys if you want to go further and try to basically be able to implement everything you see on that screen. All right, so as John said, the first step and the most important directory of the project is our src.js folder. And in the src.js folder, you have an index.js, which is the entry point. It's the point where you import the main components, you create the main instance, and you import the style, the CSS. And this entry point will be then compiled, minified, transpiled, and also optimized for the rendering. So in that script, I'd like to show you how CSS is imported. You see it's you use import and then framework7/framework7 bundle.min.css. So if you want to import other styles, well, what you have to know is all files, they are located, all the JavaScript libraries, dependencies, they are located in the node module because you install them with npm. And if you go in the node module, you can find framework7. So framework7 is here. And this is where you find the bundle.min.css file. It's directly here. So that's why you have framework7/framework7 bundle.min.css. But if you want to have other styles like right to left CSS or whatever, or non-minified CSS, that's up to you. You can choose whatever you want. Here it's a modular approach, but very important. We only import what we need. We don't import other components. We just import what is necessary, which leads to a lighter code, a lighter JS bundle. And as John mentioned, JavaScript code size matter because if the size is large, then the application will run slowly. So let's give some layered basics. This we'll have to move into app.ui.r. All right. So all what framework7 needs to know is to have this tag here, the div with a specific ID. So we gave the application ID, but it could be any ID you want. What matters is this ID needs to be exactly the same that on the JS side, this one here. So if you call it Toto, it should be also Toto on that file as well. And then you have a list, you have another tag which contains the JavaScript file, which is produced by Packer. So that's the minified JavaScript file. So that follows the basic HTML structure of a web page. You see on the right side, you have some HTML, it says a web browser, that's an HTML document. Then you have the HTML element, and inside you have the head. In the head, you will find many different things like meta tags and also useful scripts, useful styles. This is where you import CSS, JavaScript. And in the body, the second element, you have the application, and after that, you have the index.js. So that's particular to framework7 here and also other frameworks, but let's just focus on framework7 here. The JavaScript file needs to be after the application element. In R, it's slightly different. You see, we don't have the head. But if you look at the golem add external resource function, if we go below, this is what this function does. It creates a head tag and it adds many different things that you don't really need to care about that. Some meta tags and also a title tag for the web browser tab. So that sets the basic structure, and everything was made by Packer, just had to copy and paste. Now let's see the basic application template we need from framework7. So I mean the page layout we'll be using. So that's the simplest layout. It's the simple page template. So the application is a wrapper. So here we are on the body in the application div, and inside the only thing we need is a view, which is the main view also. And inside we have the page content, and in the page content we have the navigation bar at the top, the toolbar at the bottom, and the page content in the center. So if you do run app again, what you see is in the top you have the navigation bar. Here you have the page content, and at the bottom you have the toolbar. That's only those elements. We don't have anything fancy here. Just want to focus on the component, the select input we want to add later. A little specificity here is the use of JSX. So if you are familiar with React, you may know JSX, which is a syntactic extension of JavaScript. Here we won't be using React, but still we'll be using JSX because it's very convenient to combine HTML and JavaScript together, and without having to use string interpolation everywhere. So that's much more convenient, and you will see it during the practice part. Here on the left side, you have basically a component without JSX. So you would have to use a template tag, which is not very commonly used HTML tag, with a div inside and some specific attribute inner HTML with a $title to insert a JavaScript variable. And then below you will have the script part with some function defined inside. You define the title variable, and then you have a strange thing at the bottom, which is a render function. So that's not really, that's quite difficult to manage, quite difficult to understand. And on the right side, you have the JSX approach. You export the function, you define a JavaScript variable, and then you return a render function. So that's an anonymous function. And that returns like very simple thing, the div with title, the title class, and the title variable, and that's it, nothing more. Little thing to know, as John mentioned, if you go in the src.js and you open the only JSX thing we have, you see that it's not highlighted by default because in theory, you don't write JSX in RStudio IDE. That's not made for web development by design. If you use VS Code, it's already here by default, but you can still change it to JavaScript. So that's not perfect, but at least you can see some highlighting. Sometimes you have errors, parsing errors in the margins. Here, but it will be fine for the workshop. But yeah, that's important to know. So let's talk about Framework 7 components. Here we'll be designing, as I say, the idea is to have the main component, which is the application, and then we'll be designing subcomponents, and those subcomponents will be imported into the main component. A bit like if you are designing Shiny modules, right? You design a big module, then you have submodules inside, and you can reuse those modules anywhere, like everywhere you want. That's the same principle here. So a Framework 7 components have two default parameters by default. You have props, and props gather all attributes. So if you take the HTML example of the component, I have two attributes, user ID. User is David, ID is Compo. And if I call props inside my function, I can access the user doing prop.user, and I can access the ID by doing props.id. That's the thing here. So that gather everything, and that's much more convenient to work with JavaScript. And the context, it's a quite complex variable, a quite complex parameter. because it stores many different things from Framework 7, especially the application instance. And we'll be talking about that in few minutes. So the application instance will be accessed with $F7. That's the only thing you need to know. After that, the component must, so you have your JavaScript code you write, and then at the end of the component, you return a render function. So you must use the return keyword, an anonymous function, and then you return your component with your HTML and also your JavaScript variable if necessary. Components may be self-closed. So that is, you don't need to have like paired tags as you classically have with HTML, like h1 and a closing tag here. For components, you may only have the component and that's it. So now let's explore the main app components. If we open the app.f7.jsx, you see that this follows the principle we mentioned. There is a props component and then a $F7, which refers to the application instance. And the application instance will be very convenient to be able to access different properties from the application, like the widget state, what is the currently selected value from the select input. So you'll see later how it works. And it returns the HTML I was mentioning. So that's the piece of thing with the app ID, the view, the page, the navigation bar, the toolbar, the page content. And you see I can seamlessly inject some JavaScript variable in the HTML. So I define my variable above and I call it here with curly brackets, and that's it. So if you have ever wrote React applications, you should be quite familiar here. So now we go back to index.js. So after importing Framework 7, importing the CSS, and importing the main app components, it's time to initialize the application. So here we create a new instance of the Framework 7 object class, sorry. So it targets the app elements. That's the thing which is the most important here. It will not work if you change it. You may play with it if you want, as I'm speaking. And here I have some other options. Here I say I want to use an iOS theme by default, but you could use any other theme. And the last important thing is the app component. I have a component slot, and I plug my app, which I import from the file, from the JSX file here. And this is how I say that Framework 7 will inject the layout you see in that file into the template which was provided by Coene. There are many other options available, but here that's not like the main purpose of the workshop. If you want to play later with that, you can access the Framework 7 documentation and change the options. Some little practice. So here I ask you to change the theme from iOS to material design. So that's quite simple. I will just change iOS to MD. Then I need to bundle my code. So I do packer bundle. I do package load all, and then I run my application. And you see that the design is slightly different. Here I use the material design from Android. And so the navigation bars, they have shadows, which is different from the iOS style. But you don't see so much difference here because we don't have a lot of components, but believe me, in practice with complex application, if you look at the Framework 7 documentation, that makes a huge difference. The other thing you can change is going to the app_ui.r in the R folder, and you will enable the dark mode, because nowadays the dark mode is something which is widely used in all applications. It's very convenient if you work late, especially for that workshop. It's 10 p.m. in Switzerland, and yeah, it's better to work with a dark when you work in the evening. So what we do is we can add a class to the body element here, and we add a theme dark class. So it will tell the application I want to use a dark theme. And it's best practice to call it at the top level because it will apply to all children. If you call it you could call it only in the page contents, but what would happen is the navigation bar and the toolbar won't inherit from that class. So each time you modify something, so here in that case, I don't need to bundle because I didn't touch the JavaScript. So you could just do load all and run app. And you see the application now is running with a manual design on the dark theme. And finally, you may also change the main color, which actually gives the color to links to many different components. That also applies, you can apply it on the body element and add it after the theme dark. Yeah, so it's color theme and then dash, and you choose the color you want. So I'm going to choose orange. If you click, it says here, if I click here in the slides, this is where I can get access to all Framework 7 available colors. You see there are plenty different colors. You can even create custom colors. Here, just let's stick with the provided colors. I do package load all. I do run app again, and what you see is my links at the bottom, because I only have 2 links here, they are becoming orange instead of being blue by default. So just to give you an overview that this is highly customizable, there are many more components. We won't be able to talk about everything today, but just keep that in mind. Let me do a break. Is it all right?
I haven't seen any questions in the chat, but if you have an issue,
there's a few questions that have come into me, David, through the private chat in Zoom, and I think some people are having trouble getting a few of the apps to run.
Right. Well, is there a main issue that we can look into now?
Yeah, so the first one was they were asking about the app UI.r file. And they were saying it was a little bit shorter for some reason, or that it just looks different than what you were running.
Because maybe if, when you run the Packer Scaffold Framework 7, you need to replace the Golem one. You need to copy and paste the code, which was provided by default. That's that's something which John made live.
Just it's gonna look ugly, but it's fine. So you just I pasted that in the chat. So when we build the scaffold, so if you joined a bit later, you might have missed that. I apologize. So when we set up the scaffold, there was some instructions printed in the console telling us to essentially change the app underscore UI.r file. We've done that, but if you've missed it, I've pasted it in the chat. We won't be really using this file. Is it missing something in the chat? It looks like it didn't paste everything because it's too long. It's bear with me. I'm going to create a quick gist and I'll share that in the chat. But essentially, normally, if that is the issue, if you replace it with this, it should be fine. So take this link and copy paste what you have in there. Essentially, if you replace that, then reload, rerun, it should work. If it still doesn't, then the problem must be elsewhere.
I think from a setup perspective, I saw at the beginning, because we had a few people that joined late, there was a Packer scaffold golem line that they had to run. And then there was another one I thought that I saw that was a requirement. Double check. It was the Packer bundle function. Do you need to run both of those? And I wasn't sure what order those were needed.
Just go ahead, David, take it.
The scaffold is necessary with framework 7 equal true just to set up the framework 7 script. We are currently reviewing now. And the bundle is to each time you change the JavaScript files, you add a new component, you need to call Packer bundle. And even at the beginning, you don't have in the inst folder, you don't have the index.js file. So you need to call Packer bundle first. At least once to generate that file, and then you can run your application. If you don't call Packer bundle, if you directly run the application, then you won't see anything because there is no JavaScript. If you open the JavaScript console, you will see an error that index.js is missing because it's actually not on the server.
Awesome. So just make sure I'm following. So they run the Packer scaffold golem function first, and then after that, run the Packer bundle function, and both of those run those in the console. Is that okay?
Yes, and replace the app UI.
Okay, and replace the app UI. Okay, perfect.
When you scaffold, when you run the scaffold, I'm afraid it's a bit it's impossible to undo. So, but when you run the scaffold, make sure you set the argument framework 7 to true. That's what we're working with here.
Yep. I gave a few people just the line of code directly from your slides. That piece.
Lovely. Yep. Hopefully, I wrote the right one in the slides then.
I had a few people ask the Packer bundle. I wasn't sure if they should have run that one first or second, but it sounds like if they run the scaffold one and then
yeah, even if you got it the wrong way around, that doesn't hurt. So,
okay.
So we're good there. Yeah, don't worry. Thank you very much, Phil.
Yeah.
Right, Phil. So feel free to keep messaging, but you can, if you have other stuff, feel free to direct message me too. I'll try and answer now. And David, take it away.
All right, so I still have one slide to go, and then it will be your turn, John. All right, so let me talk about the Smart Select component. So this is the component we are going to code. So that's an improved select input. And that's basically, you have the layout here on the right side. That's the HTML layout. So if you, let's just take the simple thing. If you do library Shiny and you call select input, let's just see what HTML structure we get. So this is what I get when I do a simple select input. I get like a div container with a label tag, which contains the name of the select. And inside I have my select tag with many different options. So you have individual option tags containing different choices I can do with my select, with some JavaScript stuff. Right. So on the framework 7 side, you have a quite similar structure. So you have an external div with some UL tag because it's just to make it a bit nicer to display. Because in theory, in framework 7, you can display several smart selects on top of each other. That's the reason why you have that li elements. They are supposed to be in lists. And this smart select is triggered by an HTML link and then inside you recover, you find the select tag with an option, specific option, and the label tag, which is not shown here because it's too big, but that's the main idea. Just to show you how it looks in the demonstration, if we go in the components, it's called Smart Select. So this is, you add different things. It can open in a specific page. It can open in a model, and you can even search inside when there are a lot of different choices. And you can open it in at the bottom here, and also with a popover design. So that's quite nice widget we are going to implement. So now let's go back to the practice. Slides 40. It's your turn, John.
Lovely, thank you. Let me start sharing my screen. Let's just stop sharing yours. Share screen. This one here. All right, so slide 40, am I correct? Stopping from not late, but I think we're on slide, yes. So David showed you the basic structure for a standard select input, and the idea here this time is that we use this new input. So again, like many things, that it seems to be a recurring pattern, but we need to import new dependencies that you see here. There's two imports. One, the sheet.js and the smart-select.js. These are two components. And then we essentially register it with Framework 7. So we sort of tell Framework 7 that we're using these components. So what I'm going to do is I'm just going to copy this again. We're going to go to the, if you're lost, you go to src. Let me open this first. src.js index, which is this file that's already open here. And before we import the app, we can import these two components. So we have the sheet and the smart select. The sheet is required to open the smart select. We don't have the input just yet. This is again just the dependencies from Framework 7. So I'm gonna go back to the slides. Hopefully I haven't gone too quick. Go back to the slides. So what do we have on the next? Again, so we have quite a bit of code that we're going to copy, but essentially David showed you the standard select. Here the HTML looks slightly different, and again it's in a prop. So what I'm going to do first is I'm going to copy. We're going to create a new file. So we're going to put that in a separate component under the component directory. So I'm going to go ahead and create this file right now, which is over here. We're going under components. And I'm going to create a file to go. All right, new file. And we're going to do. Should I select JavaScript? I can't remember. Doesn't matter, I think. And this is going to be, I'm going to say it already, in src.js components. And it is widget.f7.jsx. Yeah. All right. So again, we don't have the syntax highlighting. So because after you thinks it's a text file, so I'm going to switch it to JavaScript. So when we put some code in here, we'll see some color. So I got the file name right. I'm going to paste that in, and then we're going to take our time to go through the code. Oh, this goes here. This goes full screen. I'll paste that in. So here we're going to take a few minutes to understand what's happening. So evidently right now we just have this as a separate file. So we're going to go back to this to the slide in a second, or maybe there's no need. We're going to go through a quick sort of exercise-ish kind of thing to familiarize ourselves with this. But it's just a file on its own. It doesn't do anything. And we have a few things in there that we need to replace in order for it to work anyways. But it's a separate file. It exports the component, but the component is currently not imported anywhere. The first thing we need to think through is we have a couple of placeholders. We have ID here that's used twice, and we have label here that's used in here. What is this? Well, this is going to be the ID of the select input. So a bit like, sorry, David showed you before. So this is the ID here, and then the label choices. Just want to do something. And so as you can see, this is the ID, and we find it here. Okay, this is for the label. This is the ID, and the label is somewhere mysterious. It's in here, the label. And essentially something similar here, but we need to rebuild that with JSX and Framework 7. So I've talked for quite a bit, but essentially you may have understood already what goes in here. These are attributes that are going to be passed to the component, and they need to make their way through here. And the way they do that, as David mentioned before, everything's captured in the props. So I can replace that with props.id. This is what we want here. Over here, I can again replace our props.id. And here we're going to need, sorry, the label. And this is going to be props.label. That's why I'm going to save the file. If you have any question, please do feel free to interrupt me. But here we're correct. JSX will correctly understand that this is an ID, needs the quotes, no need to put them. Works like magic, essentially. Oops, sorry. Let's go back full screen. Again, don't change that, and this is why we needed the sheet component. This is how it opens. As David showed before, there's a few different ways to open this. So, like I said, now we did build build the component that's currently doesn't do too much. We'll expand that later on, but it's in a file, and the file exports it. But now it's not imported anywhere. So let me get back to my RStudio here. So we have widget.f7.jsx that exports this component, but this component is not used anywhere. Where do we need it? We need it here in the application. In order to have it available in the application, we're going to need to import it. So we're going to go import. We here, well, there's a few things you can do. When we export, we don't give it a name, so you can name it what you want. Convention has it. It starts with a capital letter. Yeah, but you can technically name it something else. Generally, we keep it sort of consistent, something we can recognize, debug later. So where do we import it from? We import it from this file, and I'm going to type this f7.xx, and then real briefly, and something that is very important is the path. It's a relative path, and it's extremely important. I'm going to jump quickly to index.js to show you. You notice the difference here. Import framework, framework 7. Actually, when you do something like this without a path, the JavaScript is going to assume that this is a dependency that you've installed. It is going to look for it in the node modules repository, which for some reason I can't find it here. It's going to look for it in here. However, that's not what we're doing here. We're in the app.jsx, and we're importing the widget from another file, which is this file. So every time you import from the file that you write, you need the path. So like this, we import it, but then we don't do anything with the widget. Where do we place it? We're going to place it here. now I can replace page content with widget. And as David showed you before, self-closing tags, so they're just we don't need a closing tag like this. And again, in here we use the prompt to gather the ID and the label. So we need to pass this in here. Here I'm going to give it an ID. I'm sure David and I agreed on something here, but I forgot what it is. So I'm just going to name it variable. It's going to be clear enough. And then the label, I'm going to write select a variable. If you follow along, please make sure you use variable here. The label can change, but if you change something here, you will have to change it somewhere else. And here I think we're fine for this bit. Again, what I did is importing this here, and I used a widget in there. I'm going to go back here because otherwise I'm going to be quick and follow along. It's a bit difficult. Import on the first line is what we did, and then we used the widget here with an ID variable and label. I think it should be good. If you have any questions, please do interrupt later. Maybe we'll do a quick catch up.
You probably want to bundle and to run the application just to see the difference.
Yeah, good point. Good point. Let's do that. So we've done something in our widget. It doesn't do much just yet, but we can, as David suggested, since we made changes to the src.js, if we rerun the app like this, none of this would be reflected. We need to recreate that bundle with JavaScript that's actually imported in the app with Packer bundle. Then I should be able to just load all and run app. Hopefully you see a difference. If you don't, there's a bug in my code. Hey, we can select a variable, but there's currently no variable to select from. And that is, correct me if I'm wrong, David, but I think that is the sheet, and that's why we needed to import a sheet component. So we didn't put the variables in there to select. So that's what we have. So we have a select input technically. We could leave it at that, but we're not gonna. I'm on slide 43 now, and the idea is to dynamically generate this these options that we're gonna have in the select input. Sorry. So we've split it in two steps. So the first step is we're gonna create an array which is the equivalent of an R vector with some names from the empty cars dataset. And then we're just going to use map, which is pretty much exactly the same as per map, to loop over this array and generate the options that we need. So I'm going to go ahead and copy paste this here. Copy the first bit only. And we're going to go here at the top. Sorry. So the names, I can't remember what we said. I think it was HP. I should really know this data set by now, but so many times and yet. So we declare a constant, called names that includes those names. Then what we want to do is map over them, which is the same as lapply over per map, like I said. Set it's a method in here, so we have names.map. Pass it a function. This is again nice bit of JSX ES6 syntax, I think, or CS6 at least, but this is essentially an if statement. If the name is equal to WT, I have HP to enter once. That's fine. We have the weight, I think it's the weight. If it's equals to, the name is equals to weight, if selected is going to be true, otherwise it's false, and selected is used here, obviously, to determine what is the default option selected. In this case, I'm going to leave it like that, as weight is selected in curly braces. Now we have to pass these values, but in here, they're not, admittedly not very interesting because we only have one loop in an array, but it's to show that you could do something much more interesting. So we're going to use the name everywhere. So that is, whoop, I'm missing an M. The name, what's going to be displayed in the option is going to be HP with row weight, and their corresponding values and keys are going to be the same. But it could very well be different. So this is for select options, and that's the first bit. Now I'm going to go back to, I should minimize this. I'm going to go back to the slides, and we have the second step. Now this is in the return function, which we already have. What we only need to do is, well, actually place the select tags. Now I'm going to take a second again, just to make sure we're clear. If I go back here and I rerun this, let's simplify it. So now do I use select tags? No, it didn't. I'm going to put more options. More options. There we go. So what we just did here is create these options, and we loop over them so that we create all these options that we need here based on an array. But what we then need is, well, this parent select tag that we currently don't have. So let's put that away. I've copied the code from the slides, and here we have it. That's what we have the select, but it's empty. What we need to put is our select options in there. So I'm going to go like this. Again, curly braces. This is JavaScript code that needs to be evaluated. And like this, we should be good. So now we define the array. That creates all the options. We pass the options here. Again, I think what I'm going to do is bundle this. Maybe after that, if there are questions, we can take them. I suspect that might have been a bit quick. If there are questions, we can go through them. Happy to. So I'm going to bundle this. So now all of that is no, actually it does it. Reflex. Package load is what we're loading, what we're using. And then run out. And hopefully, if I did things right, we should see the select input. Now I have the select input, we see the default value, that's what we had here, is selected, and when I click on it, we have different options. You can see that it changes, it works according. I left the dark theme in the original method. And I think here I'm gonna let David talk you through. I'm gonna stop sharing my screen. If you have any questions, please, I do realize it may have been a bit quick. I'm going to open the chat. I see it's a bit busy. There's a few questions, so I pasted the gist that I created here. So what we have is this file here, which is this widget.f7.jsx. The whole content I have sent to you. Maybe a bit small on the screen, but we had step 1 here, which is creating this array of names, which is at the top here, right after the open curly braces. And then within the return function at the bottom, we already had this select input. And what we need to do is place our options in there. So I'll keep an eye on the chat for a minute. Hopefully David can sort things out.
Could you, in the meantime, John, could you show, let's say you make a mistake in JavaScript, could you make like an error and do bundle and see what happens in the packer?
Well, I guess that's an error. Yeah. Well, I can't come up with a clever error right now. But so I don't finish the array. This obviously isn't valid all JavaScript code, but actually what David I think hints at, the good thing is one of the advantages when you bundle the code. There's something, the bundler essentially that can check for that before you put that to production. Because technically there's nothing that stops me from writing that. But now if I run bundle, it's gonna throw an error, or it should at least. And they tend to be scary errors, but eventually you well, although this one is rather clear that there is something missing. But at least this has stopped me from making a typo or mistake and pushing to production source to code that actually was never going to run. This is another good thing with those bundlers and Webpack that we use here. How are we doing, David? Not sure.
I don't know what happens. I tried locally, it works, but my RStudio server is completely crashed.
Yeah, but you can do it locally, right? If you want. Otherwise, I'll.
If you're in RStudio Server Pro, you can just log right back in, David. It will remember your state.
This is what I did. I closed everything. I cleared the cache, but I still get the same problem.
Get the same problem. Which problem are you getting?
It just does nothing. It shows me I changed the script, but it does nothing at all. It was working when I was doing the demonstration, but now nothing is working anymore.
Do you want to take it locally? Because that's pretty much the same if it's your RStudio session. Huh?
Yeah.
It's entirely up to you. Otherwise, take the next slide. What do you want to do?
Yeah,
David?
but locally, I have the very basic project. I don't have the.
All right.
I have to restart
from the next slide. If you the whole selling point here is that it's quick to set up. So let's see if you can catch up. But in the meantime, I'll move on to the next slide. And maybe, or if you want, I'll move on to the next slide, which is Barry. But if you want, you can talk over it, and then I'll write the code if that makes sense to you. Does that work for you, David?
That's better if you continue, because it will just not restart, I think.
All right. Okay. So let me show you again. What I'm going to do is run up real quick. You don't have to do that. Just to show you. So we have a lovely select input here, but it doesn't do anything. Well, not really, because it selects a variable, but what we want to do, if you remember the beginning of the workshop when we had the introduction, is we want to use this variable to now use it in Shiny to generate the ggplot2 visualization. So we have this selected value that needs to travel all the way from the browser to the Shiny server. And how we're going to do this is surprisingly simple. So we're going to create a new function here within the widget component. And then later, it's on the next slide, we'll make use of this function to retrieve the value of the select input. So I'm going to copy this, just this bit here, recover select value. Not sure I should do it like this. It must be too small for many people, so I'm going to maximize this. So again, I'm in here. Then we had the return function above that. I'm going to define get select value. This is a function that takes the ID of the element from which we want to retrieve the value. So here I have to use the ID. Use the pound sign here. It's going to make a valid JavaScript CSS selector. And then here we have a function that's from actually the Shiny JavaScript library. And there is this function called set input value, if I could spell it right. And essentially that's going to set an input that you're going to be able to pick up in your server session as part of the inputs. That is, for instance, if you used select input ID in your UI, the way you're going to pick it up in the server is with input ID, because I've defined ID here. Well, essentially here what we're doing we're doing this, and we're going to be able to get it in the input object. Now, where is it going to be available? Well, we have to define that here. Now, of course, you can hard code that if you want. Now, that's hard coded. But the problem is if we start using the select input in multiple places, it's going to get very confusing. So what we're going to do is we're just going to use the ID essentially. That's all we need. So the ID is passed, and the ID is passed from, well, we'll pass it later. We'll see where it comes from. And this is going to be the ID here. So essentially, we're going to have it's going to be the same ID as the select component, just like any standard input in Shiny. So, and then the second argument is the data to send. Here, it's a function internal to F7. If you do standard JavaScript, they look very similar. So we get the value from the currently selected input. Now, if define the function here, like I said, but with this function is only defined, it's never used anywhere. So, as you can see, 6 out of 6, we're nearly there. Please bear with us. Again, if you look at in the same component, we're not moving file. What we can have is on this item link thing, we can have a non-change attribute, and this is gonna it's going to be a JavaScript function that's going to run when the select input changes. So again, if I remember correctly, all I need really is just the onChange line here, which is not full. So we'll fill that in. So I think it was here. It was on this item here.
I'm back, John, in case you want to switch. I managed to get it working again.
Lovely. You know what? Because I'm losing my voice and everything, so I'm going to stop sharing my screen and you take over. Is that okay?
Yeah.
Cool.
Thank you, John. So I was able to restart everything and to recover the session. So as John was mentioning, we built, so we need a function that captures an event when the select input changes. And that's the get select value. So that's a callback which is invoked each time we change the value. And this uses the F7 API but the only component we are like, if you remember, but the context parameter, but the only piece we are using. And this app component is useful because you can select any instance of the Smart Select class. So all Smart Select have the Smart Select class. So you just do $f7.smartselect, and then you can get the specific Smart Select you want by its ID. And then for each select, you can get its value. You have a get value method, which is described in the Framework 7 documentation. So here, everything we do is we add a non-change property to the link element of the Smart Select, which is an anonymous function, and it calls the get select value taking the props.id method parameter. Sorry. So to test it on the to test whether the Shiny input is properly set, what we can do is go in the app_server.r. We go here, and I'm going to add like an observe event, which is listening to the variable, the input we created on the JavaScript side. So if you remember, that will be var input $var, because that's the ID we gave when we called the component. So let's do input $var, and then
sorry, I think when I did it, I put variable. So if you have variable there, put variable. Point is they must match.
Did you put variable really?
Yeah, I think I put variable. The ID there of the widget is variable on my screen. Let me double check. Yeah.
Okay, so you can put whatever you want here. You can put whatever ID, but what is important, if you put that ID here, you must have the same on the Shiny side, because that's the ID you recover for Shiny. All right, and after that, I do packer bundle. And I also reload the package file because I changed the app server.r script. And I run my application. So what you see here is the application, and by default, this third element is selected. So if we go back to the widget.f7, we said, if the name is WT, then it will be selected. So that's the reason why that's the third element which is selected. But if you change to HP, that will be the first one. But what is important is now if you click on HP, you see that on the Shiny side, the value is changed. It's HP, and then it's QSEC, it's WT. So now you have almost everything. You get the interface, you get the widget, and you also make the link with the Shiny side. And as John said, the most important component to make the link with Shiny is the shiny.setInputValue. You may have heard about onInputChange, which is also a method which would work. That's the old one. That's a bit confusing. The name is confusing. Don't know what you think. SetInputValue is much better. So let's use it for the remaining. And that's it. Yeah, that's where we stop on the JavaScript side. So only simple widget, but you see there are already a lot of things for that widget. You need to set up the app layout. You need to import the component. If it's the first time you work with this kind of approach, like you have like subcomponents, you import them, that may be a bit overwhelming, but with practice, if you try again later, if you create new components, then it will make more sense. What is nice also with this modular approach is if you go in the app.f7.jsx file, then we may create another widget. So you can create var2 here, select a variable, and then it will create another widget. So it will be exactly the same variable because they are kind of hard-coded here. What we could create is an extra parameter to be able to define variables on the fly and then process them directly from here. I'm not going to do it here, but that's the main principle. If I recompile my code, let's do it quickly. And I'm going to, oh, sorry, I just forgot to save. And in the meantime, I'm going to create a second observe event, and I will listen to the second variable. All right, and now I do run my R script. So I have two select inputs this time. All right. Yeah, I'm only interested with the first one. So let's erase that code. But that's just to show you that you can easily create other components if you want. So now there is a short break, and then we'll have like about 10 minutes to talk about the last part, how to create a very simple visualization, and also show you what you will have to do during the homework.
Yeah, again, maybe it's a great time to debug. I don't know if I think there was one or two questions in the chat that I answered. I don't know if anything came your way, Phil, or anyone else. Please feel free to ask.
So yeah, let's copy the app.jsx. Oh, you already created a gist, right?
Yeah, I did. I pasted it yesterday in the chat, in case you got lost on that file.
Shall we restart?
Yeah, but I'm fine with it as you. Yeah.
This one is quite straightforward compared to what we did. That was very technical, the previous part, and now it's easier. So that's about creating the visualization. So just to be humble, here we'll be using ggplot2. That's complex enough, and we'll dive into JavaScript for the homework. So we build a simple regression model with the empty cars dataset on ggplot2. We have one variable which is selected on the JS side, Granjon created in the widget. So you can select HP, QSEC, and WT. And on the there is one variable which is fixed, MPG, and we will use a very simple formula you have on the slide 50. So here the idea is to create our ggplot output. So what we do is we be using, we go in the app server.r, and we already have ggplot2, which is imported, as you see in our Oxygen documentation. So that's something you don't have to worry about. And then, yeah, that's something just to fill the code. We'll be using empty cars. Here we need, so we plot MPG, which is fixed, and then we'll be plotting the selected variable on the, which is given by JavaScript. And then that simple geom point and plus geom smooth for the regression. So that's really simple here. So the output will be, ID will be plot. That's important, and that's the only thing we do on the app server.r, nothing more. Now to insert the plot in the skeleton, in the layout. So just keep in mind that when you are using output dollar, whatever ID you want, you also need in the UI part to call plot output with the same ID you created on the server part. Here we won't be able to use plot layout because if you remember, we use app.ui.r, and inside, the app layout is directly inserted into this tag. This is an anchor, and you cannot edit it. Or you could edit after, but that would not match. That would not be correctly displayed. So what you have to know is, when you copy plot output plot here in the console and you run it, it generates HTML code. This is what Shiny does. There are many R wrappers, and that what it does is it creates HTML with everything needed to work properly. And here we'll be copying this HTML code into the app.f7.jsx after the select widget. And that's the only thing we need to know, we need to do. We don't need to change the width, we don't need to change the height. That would be perfect for that demonstration. And then we do, I don't remember. No, I didn't change the JavaScript. So I just do.
Yeah, you did. You added the plot. So you need to download.
Oh yeah, you're right. Yeah. This is the last thing I did. Yeah. So I do Packer bundle, and then package load all, run app. You see here that I have my plot with WT as a function of MPG, and then I can select another variable. It will update the plot, and so on. So now everything works together. We have the input, which is created JavaScript side, and we also the plot is the container is on JavaScript side, and then input is recovered on the Shiny side, and the plot is created by ggplot and is sent back to JavaScript. And this is the whole piece together, how it works. So you could make something a bit nicer if you want to improve the design, is to use a card container. I showed you in the demonstration, like Framework 7 have card containers. So what we can quickly do is go in the documentation, the Framework 7 documentation, which is an amazing documentation. Let's just say it. And here I'll be using, I'm just copying these tags here. This is the card layout with the card class, the card header, card content, card footer. I don't really need the header, the footer. I just need the content. So I'm gonna only keep the card and the card content, and I'm going to put the plot inside. Okay, so let me clean the header and the footer. So that's the point. Here you see we don't have the proper indentation. So in VS Code that would be a bit easier. All right, and now I do bundle. I don't need to import any other JavaScript element because the card is not a JavaScript component. Everything is included in the CSS. That's something important to mention. And you see that my plot is included in the card container. So in theory, but if you run it from the app.r script, which is at the top level, there is also, we are using the thematic package, which can, apply the dark theme based or the light theme based on the current app theme. So if I run it from here, you see that that's much better here. So the ggplot has a dark background, and you can see the card components much better. So that's that's basically we are at the end of the workshop here. Do you want to take the lead, John?
No, I'm fine. Please continue.
Okay,
although I'm not sure we want to cover that essentially. Because we at the beginning when we designed the workshop, we used a ggplot to have a JavaScript visualization, and then we realized it would take far too long, so we moved it as something optional that we can do ourselves.
That's the main point we had. It was a bit too ambitious. It would take about 30 to 45 minutes to do that JavaScript part. So that's not realistic for 2 hours workshop. But I think that's enough technical with the previous part. But yeah, so now we have the select input with the plot. Which is running with the Framework 7 template. Everything is driven by JavaScript. You wrote the component with JavaScript. You wrote the select with JavaScript. Only the plot and the regression is performed by R. So from a technical perspective, that's less work that has to be done by R, because sometimes, when you're developing Shiny app, there are many things like UI components which are handled by R and that could actually be handled by JavaScript. So you could imagine that concept like working with a front-end developer which is familiar with JavaScript technologies, which knows about the bundler, Webpack, parcel, ES-build, anything that could basically develop a bootstrap based design with JavaScript, CSS, HTML, or with Framework 7. And on the other hand, you would have the R developer, which sometimes it disappears, with only our background, who doesn't know about JavaScript, but that's not a problem, because with what you saw here, the only thing that the R developers need to know is to create the app server.r. So here that was very simple, but in practice, you may imagine to have like different modules, and the R developer will just create the business logic, create functions, call modules, and that's it. And he would talk to the JavaScript developer, the front-end developer, to link with Shiny, but that would basically be the idea.
Did it very quick because I have I think some people on the last bit on rendering the plot. If you could just walk people through really quick, because I've had some questions on people not being able to render the plot. So I guess the server side must be fine, but there's maybe something missing on the front end on how you got the div for the plot inside the app.
Oh yeah. So what I did, so the only thing you need to know is if I create my output $plot, and this will be the ID I need to pass on the UI side. And if I use render plot, I need to use plot output. That's like the other function on the UI side with the same ID. And this is the thing, this piece of HTML, I can put it in the chat. This piece of HTML I will include in the app.f7.jsx. I include it after the widget inside here. So just for the style, I created a card component, a Framework 7 card component, because it's nicer, but you're not obliged to add it. That was just for the demonstration. If you are using another library, if you're using Plotly, render Plotly, then you would do Plotly output, and then it would generate the HTML you copy in the app.f7.jsx, and you do the same. But you see at some point that's not optimal, because you still need to copy some things, to run that code in the console, to copy it in the JavaScript part. The reason why at some point you may want to leverage JavaScript libraries, as I'm showing on that slide. And the purpose was using eCharts library. So you may know eCharts for R, which John developed. That's an HTML widget, which is based on the eCharts.js library. And here the purpose is using the pure JS library and to replace the previous ggplot2. I'm not going to detail everything, but you have all the slides here from slides 54 until 63 to do the exercise. And that basically you have to fill the gaps in the code and copy at different places in your application. An extra step here is you have to install the eCharts libraries. So you still have the command. You'll need to use packer npm install, which will install eCharts for you in the dependencies. And then in the JavaScript code, you will have to import. So here, note we use a star because you import everything from eCharts. And we also use eCharts JL. That is another dependencies needed here. And everything is written in those slides to get the thing working. And I also have a correction of the workshop until the ggplot part. So we'll send you a zip file containing the full project with everything working, so that you can start doing the homework.
Thank you. I don't know if anyone has any questions. We have 4 minutes left. I think I tried to debug what I could there. I'm happy to answer anything that might come to mind. And thank you very much to everyone for taking the time. I don't know where you're based. David and I are in Switzerland, and it's midnight now for us. She's not. I'm not using that as an excuse for anything, but yeah. So thank you very much for taking the time, 2 hours of your time to spend that with us. Hopefully you've learned something. If you utilize something you have there right now.
We have a question from Andrew.
Yeah, hi.
Hi, Andrew.
Just thank you both for putting this on. This is really great. So my question is, like, after we finish the homework, like, do you have any recommendations on where we go from there? Or like some example apps maybe that we could look at that are a little bit more complex?
So what happens next, and you probably noticed that, is everything happens mostly in reading the documentation. So when you start to go into HTML templates, you'll have to explore, like for Framework 7 here, I'm reviewing the documentation. And if I want to use another component, let's say I wanna, or maybe let's just take the Smart Select. As I told you, you have, let's take one thing. You have multiple methods, like you have the get value, which returns the selected value, but you also have the set value. You know, you have a lot of different things. You also have a lot of different events. You don't only have on change, but you also have open, opened, closed, closed. So all those things you could leverage in your application. So there is no easy answers. That's mostly about exploring the documentation, trying and failing and succeeding at the end.
Yeah.
But there are a few examples. Here, I made an example. I think it's under my profile. It's basically an ODE solver for the Van der Pol oscillator, you know. Let me find the link. So that was built using exactly the same concept with Packer. So yeah, that's a Van der Pol ODE solver, Shiny application with JSX, Webpack, Golem, and everything. And yeah, I don't know if it's VDP. No, it's not installed on that computer, but yeah, that's a solver which is using other components from Framework 7. It's using a range slider. You generate a phase portrait with, you can see fluxes, you know, that's also nice thing. And here I also do the visualization with eCharts.js. And just to show you, this is how it would look like. So the visualization is made here. So that's a bit more code, but that's, yeah, the price to pay to do everything on the JavaScript side.
Cool, thank you.
Cool. Well, thank you, everyone. I don't know, maybe, yeah, we still have 30 people. If you have questions, I'm really happy to take more. Otherwise, thank you very much for your time. Have a good evening, good day, good morning, wherever you are, whatever it is there. And thank you again. Cheers.
Yeah. Thank you, everybody. This is Phil with the program committee here at RN Pharma. Wants to thank John and David again. It's just absolutely wonderful workshop and second year in a row. Stay tuned for John or David's talk on the third day, and then the advanced Shiny panel will also be on the end of the third day. I just want to mention too that the workshop environment will stay up for about 48 hours. We host those as AWS EC2s, and they cost a little bit of money to maintain. So we'll be tearing those down. You're welcome to join the RN Pharma organization on RStudio Cloud if you'd like to continue to develop there. But some of the JavaScript dependencies I don't think are quite yet supported. So that's why we use this environment for today's workshop. But with that, I'll give John and David back their evenings, and thank you so much. And we'll see you later.
Thank you. Thank you.
Thanks,
See you during the
everybody.
conference.
Thank you.
everyone.
Yep.
Yes.
Thank you, everyone. Thank you.
Bye.
Bye.